The winter wind cut through Victoria Kensington's threadbare coat like 1,000 frozen knives, and somewhere between the snowdrift and the abandoned wagon, she realized that everything she'd ever believed about herself had been a carefully constructed lie. She pressed herself against the splintered wood of the overturned wagon, her fingers numb inside her worn gloves, her breath coming in ragged white clouds that dissipated into the brutal January air of the Texas Panhandle. 3 days ago, she'd been a respectable widow on her way to join her late husband's family in Denver. 2 days ago, the stagecoach had broken an axle in the middle of nowhere. Yesterday, the driver and the other passengers had set out on foot, promising to send help. This morning, she'd woken to realize no help was coming, and the provisions they'd left her were gone, stolen by some creature in the night or perhaps just scattered by the relentless wind. Victoria was 23 years old, and she was going to die in the Texas wilderness because she'd been too weak, too foolish, too trusting. The winter had stripped away every pretense, every polite fiction she'd told herself about her marriage, her life, her future. Her husband hadn't loved her. His family didn't want her. The money she'd thought they had was mostly debt. And now, as the cold seeped into her bones, she understood that she'd spent her entire life being exactly what everyone else wanted her to be, and it had brought her here, to this frozen moment of absolute clarity and absolute despair. She closed her eyes, and that was when she heard the horse. At first she thought it was another hallucination, like the warm fireplace she'd imagined an hour ago or the sound of her mother's voice calling her name. But the sound grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of hooves through snow, and then a man's voice, low and urgent. "Good God, Miss. Miss, can you hear me?" Victoria forced her eyes open. A figure was dismounting from a large bay horse, and then he was kneeling beside her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. She could see dark eyes, a strong jaw roughened with several days of stubble, and an expression of genuine concern that seemed so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. "I can hear you," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "How long have you been out here?" He was already shrugging out of his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still holding his body heat, made her gasp. "Since yesterday morning, maybe. I don't know any more. Can you stand? We need to get you warm, and we need to do it fast." His hands were careful as he helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to buckle. "My camp isn't far, half a mile, maybe less. Can you ride?" "I think so. Good enough." He lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to hold her steady. "I'm Harrison," he said as he urged the horse forward. "Harrison Monroe. I've got a line shack just over that ridge. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." "Victoria Kensington," she said, and then, because the cold had apparently frozen whatever part of her brain controlled propriety, she added, "I thought I was going to die." "Not today, you're not." His voice was firm, almost stern, and she felt herself relax against his chest, letting him take her weight. "I've got you now." The line shack materialized out of the swirling snow like a miracle, a small wooden structure with smoke rising from a crooked chimney. Harrison dismounted and lifted her down, then practically carried her inside, setting her in a chair near the wood stove that radiated blessed heat. "Don't get too close too fast," he warned. "You warm up too quick after being that cold. It can do damage." He moved around the small space with efficient purpose, adding wood to the fire, filling a battered pot with snow to melt for water, pulling blankets from a trunk against the wall. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday." "No, the day before. There was some hardtack and jerky, but something took it." "Probably coyotes. They get bold when they're hungry." He handed her a tin cup of water. "Drink this slow. I'll make some coffee and get some food in you." Victoria sipped the water and watched him work. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with broad shoulders and capable hands. His clothes were worn but well maintained, the clothes of a working man who took care of what he had. When he removed his hat, she saw dark hair that needed cutting and those striking dark eyes that seemed to assess everything with quiet intelligence. "What were you doing out here?" she asked. "Checking on cattle. I work for the LS Ranch about 10 miles northeast of here. We've got herds scattered across this territory, and in weather like this, we have to make sure they're not freezing or starving." He glanced at her. "What were you doing out here, trying to get to Denver?" "The stage-coach broke down and the others left me behind." Saying it out loud made it sound even worse. "They said I was too slow, that I'd hold them back." Harrison's jaw tightened. "They left a woman alone in the middle of winter. That's not just foolish, it's criminal. I'm a widow. No family to speak of, no one who'd come looking for me. I suppose they thought it didn't matter." "It matters." He said it with such conviction that she looked up at him in surprise. "Every life matters, Mrs. Kensington. The fact that they thought otherwise says something about them, not about you." He made coffee and heated up a pot of beans and salt pork, and Victoria ate slowly, feeling life gradually return to her limbs. The shack was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a table, 2 chairs, some shelves with supplies, but it felt like a palace after the frozen wasteland outside. "The storm's getting worse," Harrison said, peering out the small window. "We're going to be stuck here for a while. Could be a day, could be 3. I've got enough supplies for both of us, but it'll be close quarters. Mr. Monroe, you saved my life." "I'm not about to complain about close quarters." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "Call me Harrison, and I'm glad I found you when I did. Another few hours. I know." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Why did you come this way?" "The wagon is off the main trail. I saw ravens circling yesterday. Usually means something dead or dying. Thought it might be cattle, but I figured I should check." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the small table. "Guess Providence was looking out for you. Or for you. Maybe you needed to save someone today." He smiled, a slow, warm expression that transformed his serious face. "Maybe I did." As the afternoon wore into evening, the storm intensified, wind howling around the shack and snow piling against the walls. Harrison made sure Victoria had the bed, insisting he'd sleep on the floor near the stove, and he gave her one of his spare shirts to sleep in since her own clothes were damp and needed drying. But sleep didn't come easily. Victoria lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm and the quiet sounds of Harrison moving around the shack. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt safe. And that safety made her question everything she thought she knew about her life. Her marriage had been arranged by her father, a business transaction disguised as a respectable match. Thomas Kensington had been 15 years her senior, a merchant with ambitions and debts he'd hidden well. She'd been 18, obedient, eager to please. They'd married, moved to St. Louis, and she'd spent 5 years trying to be the perfect wife to a man who barely noticed her existence. When Thomas died 6 months ago, she discovered the truth buried in his papers. The debts, the failed investments, the money borrowed from his family that she was now expected to repay. His brother had written from Denver, offering her a place in his household, but the letter had been cold, dutiful. She'd known what it meant. She'd be a servant in all but name, working off Thomas's debts until she was too old to be useful. And she'd been going anyway because what else could she do? A woman alone with no money and no prospects had precious few options. But lying here in this tiny shack with a stranger who'd risked his own safety to save her, Victoria felt something shift inside her. The winter had stripped everything away, and in the cold clarity, she could finally see the truth. She didn't want to live her life according to someone else's plans anymore. She didn't want to be useful or obedient or respectable. She wanted to be alive. Can't sleep. Harrison's voice was quiet in the darkness. Too many thoughts. She turned her head and could just make out his shape lying on a bedroll near the stove. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "You didn't. I'm a light sleeper anyway." There was a pause. "You want to talk about those thoughts. Why would you care?" "Because you're here and I'm here and the storm's not going anywhere. And because sometimes talking to a stranger is easier than talking to people who think they know you." Victoria considered this. "Do you like your life, Harrison?" "That's a big question." "I know. But do you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yeah. Yeah, I do. It's hard work and sometimes it's lonely, but it's honest work. I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I'm not beholden to anyone except my boss, and he's a fair man. I've got my horse, my skills, and my freedom." "That's more than a lot of people can say." "I've never had that," Victoria said softly. "Freedom, I mean. I've always been what someone else wanted me to be. A good daughter. A good wife. And now I'm supposed to be a grateful widow working off debts I didn't make for family that doesn't want me." "Supposed to be," Harrison echoed. "But you don't have to be. What else is there? Anything you want. This is the frontier, Victoria. People come here to reinvent themselves all the time. You think everyone in Tascosa is who they were born to be. Half of them are running from something and the other half are running toward something, but they're choosing their own path. Tascosa, town about 15 miles from here in the Texas Panhandle. It's rough, but it's growing. Lots of ranches around, cowboys coming and going. There's a hotel, a general store, a school even, people making lives for themselves. I don't have any money. You've got skills, though. You can read and write, can't you? I can tell by the way you talk. You've had education." "Yes, my mother insisted on it." "Then you've got something valuable. The teacher in Tascosa has been looking for help. Mrs. Patterson, she's got 40 students and can barely manage them all. She's been asking the ranches if they know anyone who could assist her." Harrison shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. "I'm not saying it would be easy, but it would be yours. Your choice, your life." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I saw your face when you said you thought you were going to die. You weren't scared. You were relieved, and that's wrong. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. You don't even know me. I know you survived 3 days in winter weather that would have killed most men. I know you're strong, even if you don't think you are. And I know you deserve better than spending the rest of your life paying for a dead man's mistakes." Victoria turned onto her side, facing where he lay in the darkness. "What if I don't know how to do it? How to choose for myself?" "Then you learn. Same way you learn anything else. One day at a time." The next morning, the storm had calmed to a steady snowfall, and Harrison ventured out to check on his horse and see about the weather. Victoria dressed in her now dry clothes and attempted to make breakfast with the supplies available. A small gesture of gratitude she could manage, when Harrison came back inside, stamping snow from his boots. He looked surprised and pleased to see beans and coffee waiting on the table. "You didn't have to do that. You've done nothing but take care of me since you found me. It's the least I could offer." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Harrison said, "Storm's breaking up. We could probably make it to town by tomorrow if we take it slow." "And then what?" "And then I introduce you to Mrs. Patterson, see if she's still looking for help. If not, there are other options. The hotel might need someone or the general store. You won't starve, Victoria, I'll make sure of that." "Why?" the question burst out of her. Why do you care what happens to me?" Harrison set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, those dark eyes serious and intent. "Because someone should, and because I think you're worth caring about, even if you don't believe it yet." Something in her chest loosened, a knot she hadn't even known was there. "I want to believe it." That's a start. They spent the day preparing for the journey to Tascosa, and Victoria found herself watching Harrison, studying him. He moved with a quiet confidence, never wasting motion, never speaking unless he had something worth saying. There was a steadiness to him that she found deeply attractive, a sense that here was a man who knew himself and was comfortable in his own skin. It was so different from Thomas, who'd been all bluster and appearance, constantly performing respectability while hiding his failures. "Tell me about the LS Ranch," she said, as they sat by the fire that evening. "It's one of the biggest operations in the Panhandle, owned by a group of investors from back east, but they're mostly hands-off. The foreman runs the day-to-day operations, and we've got about 30 cowboys working the herds. It's good work if you don't mind the isolation and the weather." "You have family?" "Not anymore. My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both. I was raised by my uncle in Kansas, but he passed 5 years ago. No siblings, no wife, no children, just me and the work." "You get lonely," he considered this. "Sometimes. But lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I like my own company and I like the men I work with. Maybe someday I'll want more, but for now this suits me." "What would more look like?" Harrison glanced at her, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You ask a lot of questions, Victoria Kensington. I'm trying to understand. You seem content in a way I've never been, and I want to know how you got there." "I stopped trying to be what other people expected and started being what I wanted to be. It really is that simple, even if it's not easy." He poked at the fire with a stick. "As for what more would look like, I suppose it would be a piece of land of my own. A small ranch, maybe some horses, someone to share it with, someone who wanted the same kind of life. But that's dreams for another day." "It sounds like a good dream. What about you? If you could have anything, what would you want?" Victoria thought about this, really thought about it, perhaps for the first time in her life. "A place that's mine. Work that matters. People who see me for who I am, not who they want me to be. And maybe someone who makes me feel the way I felt yesterday when you said every life matters. Like I'm real." "You are real," Harrison said quietly. "You're the most real thing I've encountered in a long time." Their eyes met, and Victoria felt something pass between them, a recognition, a possibility. She looked away first, her heart beating too fast. "We should sleep," she said. "Early start tomorrow." But she lay awake long into the night, thinking about dreams and reality and the strange, terrifying hope growing in her chest. The ride to Tascosa took longer than Harrison had estimated because they had to navigate drifts and frozen ground, but Victoria didn't mind. She rode in front of him on his horse, his arm around her waist, and she felt safer and more alive than she'd felt in years. They talked about everything and nothing, and she learned that Harrison was thoughtful and funny, that he noticed details most people missed, that he had strong opinions about cattle and horses and weather, but was willing to listen when she disagreed. By the time they rode into Tascosa on a cold afternoon 2 days after leaving the line shack, Victoria felt like she'd known him for months instead of days. Tascosa was a rough collection of buildings clustered along the Canadian River, dominated by the courthouse and a large general store. There were saloons and a hotel, a blacksmith and a livery, and houses scattered on the outskirts. Cowboys and ranchers moved through the muddy streets, and the whole place had an air of raw potential, like it was still deciding what it wanted to become. Harrison took her directly to a neat white house near the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a formidable woman in her 50s with keen blue eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Harrison Monroe, I haven't seen you in town for months," she said, ushering them inside. "And who is this?" "This is Mrs. Victoria Kensington. Her stagecoach broke down in the storm, and I'm hoping you might be able to help her find her feet here in Tascosa." Mrs. Patterson assessed Victoria with a long look that seemed to see right through to her bones. Then she smiled. "You look like someone who's had a rough time of it. Come sit by the fire and tell me your story." Victoria did, leaving out the parts about her marriage that still hurt to think about, focusing instead on the broken stagecoach and her desire to start fresh. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, and when Victoria finished, she nodded decisively. "I do need help with the school, and if Harrison vouches for you, that's good enough for me. The pay isn't much, but it includes room and board here with me, and you'd be doing important work. These children need education if they're going to make something of themselves. Can you start Monday? I can start today if you need me. Monday will be fine. Gives you time to settle in and rest up." Mrs. Patterson looked at Harrison. "You did good bringing her here." "I just did what anyone would do." "We both know that's not true," Mrs. Patterson said dryly, "but I appreciate the modesty." Harrison stood to leave, and Victoria felt a sudden panic. "Wait, I didn't get to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." She followed him to the door, acutely aware of Mrs. Patterson's interested gaze. "You saved my life, Harrison. More than that, you made me believe I could have a different life. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay it, you live it. You make the most of this chance." He looked down at her, and his expression was tender. "But I'll be checking on you if that's all right, making sure you're settling in okay. I'd like that. I'd like that very much." He smiled, tipped his hat, and left. Victoria watched through the window as he rode away, and she felt an ache in her chest that was entirely new. "That's a good man," Mrs. Patterson said from behind her. "One of the best I've known. You could do worse than setting your cap for him. I've only known him 3 days. Sometimes 3 days is enough to see what matters." Mrs. Patterson bustled toward the kitchen. "Now come help me with dinner, and we'll talk about what you need to know for teaching." The weeks that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of Victoria's life. Teaching 40 children ranging from 6 to 16 was exhausting, chaotic, and deeply satisfying. She discovered she had a gift for explaining things, for making lessons interesting, for reaching the students who struggled. Mrs. Patterson was a stern but fair mentor, and the two women developed a warm friendship. But through it all, Victoria thought about Harrison. He came to town every 2 weeks or so, and he always stopped by the house to see her. They'd walk through town together, talking about everything and nothing, and each time he left, Victoria felt the ache in her chest grow stronger. She was falling in love with him, and it terrified her. Because what did she really know about love? Her marriage had been a cold, dutiful thing. How could she trust her feelings when everything she'd believed about relationships had been wrong? The winter deepened, January turning into February, and Victoria threw herself into her work, trying not to think about Harrison or the way her heart jumped every time she saw him riding into town. She made friends among the townspeople, attended church socials, and began to feel like she belonged in Tascosa. But the questions wouldn't leave her alone. Who was she now? What did she want? Could she really trust herself to know? It all came to a head on a frigid February afternoon when Harrison arrived in town and asked if she'd like to take a ride with him. Mrs. Patterson practically pushed her out the door, insisting she needed the fresh air, and soon Victoria was riding beside Harrison on a borrowed horse, heading out toward the prairie. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There's something I want to show you." They rode for about an hour, and then Harrison led her up a low rise. At the top, he dismounted and helped her down, then gestured at the view. Below them, the prairie stretched out in all directions, frozen and beautiful under a pale blue sky. The grass was golden where it poked through the snow, and in the distance, she could see a herd of cattle and the line of the Canadian River. "This is my dream," Harrison said quietly. "This piece of land right here. It's unclaimed, and I've been saving money to file a claim on it. Another year, maybe two, and I'll have enough to buy some stock, build a house, start my own ranch." Victoria looked at the land, trying to see it through his eyes. "It's beautiful. It could be with work, but that's not why I brought you here." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I brought you here because I need to say something, and I don't know how much longer I can keep it to myself." Her heart began to race. "What?" "I'm falling in love with you, Victoria. I've been falling since the moment I found you by that wagon, and every time I see you it gets worse. Or better. I don't even know anymore." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still figuring out who you are and what you want. I'm not asking you to feel the same way or to make any promises. I just needed you to know. Because it's driving me crazy pretending I'm just your friend when every time I leave town, I want to turn right back around." Victoria stared at him, emotions crashing through her in waves. Fear, joy, doubt, hope. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I told you I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to be honest." "But you're asking me to question everything again," she said, and her voice came out harsher than she intended. "Just when I thought I'd figured things out, just when I thought I knew who I was, you're telling me this and I have to question everything all over again. That's not what I meant to do, I know. But it's what's happening." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "Harrison, I don't trust my feelings. My marriage taught me that what I think I feel can be completely wrong. How am I supposed to know if what I feel for you is real or just gratitude? You saved my life. Maybe I've just confused that with something else. Is that what you think this is?" "I don't know what to think anymore. The winter made me question everything about my life, about who I was and what I wanted. And just when I thought I had some answers, you show up and say this, and now I'm questioning everything again. My feelings, your feelings, what any of it means." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was low and intense, "Victoria, look at me." She turned, and the expression on his face took her breath away. It was open, vulnerable, completely honest. "I can't tell you what you're feeling," he said. "Only you know that. But I can tell you what I know. I know that you're strong and smart and brave. I know that you make me laugh and think and want to be a better man. I know that I dream about you at night and think about you all day. And I know that when I imagine my future, when I imagine this ranch and this life I want to build, you're there. You're always there." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "What if I can't give you what you need? What if I'm too damaged, too confused? Then we figure it out together." "Victoria, I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm saying I'm the answer. I'm your only answer. Not because you don't have other options, but because I'm the one who sees you for who you really are and loves exactly that. Because I'm the one who wants to build a life with you, not make you fit into some life I've already planned. Because when you're questioning everything, when you don't know which way to turn, I'm the one constant. I'm the one sure thing. I'm your only answer," she repeated, testing the words. Something about them resonated deep in her chest, like a bell ringing true. "You think it's that simple? I think it can be, if you let it." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd saved her life, who'd believed in her when she didn't believe in herself, who was standing here offering her his heart with no guarantees, no demands, just honest feeling. And suddenly she knew. The questions didn't matter. The doubts didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, this man, and the way she felt when she was with him. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "It scares me to death, but I am. And maybe I don't have all the answers yet, but maybe you're right. Maybe you're the answer I need." Harrison's face lit up with a joy so profound it almost hurt to see. "Yeah, yeah." And then she was in his arms and he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and nothing had ever felt so right, so completely and perfectly right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to build you a house right here. I'm going to work as hard as I can to file that claim and get this ranch started. And I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. I want to help. I want to build it with you, not just have you build it for me. Partners." "Partners," she agreed, and kissed him again. They rode back to town as the sun was setting, and Victoria felt like she was glowing from the inside out. When they reached Mrs. Patterson's house, Harrison helped her down from the horse and held her hands in his. "I need to get back to the ranch, but I'll be in town next week. And Victoria, I meant every word, so did I." She watched him ride away, and this time the ache in her chest was sweet, not painful. She was in love. She was building a new life. She was choosing her own path. Mrs. Patterson was waiting inside with tea and an expectant expression. "Well, well," Victoria said, unable to stop smiling, "I'm going to marry a cowboy and help him build a ranch." "It's about time," Mrs. Patterson said, but she was smiling too. "That boy's been mooning over you for weeks. I thought he'd never work up the nerve to say something." "I'm terrified," Victoria admitted. "What if I'm making a mistake? Then it's your mistake to make and you'll learn from it. But between you and me, I don't think you are. I think you found something real, and that's rare enough to be worth the risk." Victoria thought about this as she got ready for bed that night. Worth the risk. Yes, Harrison was worth the risk. And more than that, she was worth the risk. She was worth choosing herself, her feelings, her future. The winter had made her question everything, but Harrison was right. He was her answer. Not her only option, but her best one. Her chosen one. The next months passed in a blur of work and planning. Harrison came to town every week, and they'd spend hours walking, talking, dreaming about their future. He was patient with her remaining doubts, answering every question, never pushing her to move faster than she was ready. In March, he filed his claim on the land he'd shown her. In April, he gave his notice to the LS Ranch, saying he'd work through the spring roundup and then strike out on his own. In May, he asked Victoria to marry him, properly this time with a ring he'd saved 3 months' wages to buy. She said yes without hesitation. They married in June, in the little church in Tascosa with Mrs. Patterson and half the town in attendance. Victoria wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself, and Harrison wore his best shirt and a new vest. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Victoria felt like she'd finally come home. The ranch, which they named the Double M for Monroe and Kensington's first letters combined, was a work in progress. Harrison had built a small cabin, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was sturdy and tight against the weather. They had 30 head of cattle, 6 horses, and enough land to grow into something bigger. It was hard work. Back-breaking, exhausting, never-ending work. Victoria learned to ride like a cowboy, to rope and brand, to deliver calves and doctor sick stock. She kept the books, managed the supplies, and still taught at the school 3 days a week because they needed the extra income and she loved the work. But through it all, she was happy. Deeply, profoundly happy in a way she'd never imagined possible. Harrison was everything he'd promised to be. A partner in the truest sense, listening to her ideas, respecting her opinions, sharing the work and the decisions. He was patient with her when she struggled, confident in her when she doubted herself, and so clearly in love with her that sometimes it took her breath away. And she was in love with him, more every day. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his quiet humor and his steady presence. She loved the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. She loved waking up beside him every morning and falling asleep in his arms every night. Their first winter on the ranch was brutal. They lost some cattle to the cold, and there were days when Victoria wondered if they'd make it. But they did together, and when spring came, she discovered she was pregnant. Harrison was beside himself with joy. He became even more protective, insisting she rest more, do less heavy work. Victoria tolerated it with amused patience, knowing it came from love, not from any desire to control her. Their son was born in November, a healthy, loud baby boy they named Henry James Monroe. Victoria had never known she could love anyone as much as she loved Harrison until she held their son for the first time, and then her heart expanded to hold them both. The years flowed by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. They added more cattle, built a bigger barn, expanded the cabin into a proper house. Victoria continued teaching part-time, and they became fixtures in the Tascosa community, respected for their hard work and integrity. 3 years after Henry was born, they had a daughter, Grace Elizabeth Monroe, who had her mother's determination and her father's steady nature. And 2 years after that, another son, William Harrison Monroe, who was all mischief and energy. Victoria watched her children grow up with a fierce protective love and a determination that they would always know their worth, always know they were loved, always have the freedom to choose their own paths. She taught them to read and ride, to work hard and think for themselves, to treat everyone with respect regardless of their station. And through it all, Harrison was beside her, her partner in every sense of the word. They argued sometimes, disagreed about decisions, faced hardships that tested them. But they always came back to each other, to the love they'd chosen that winter day when everything was uncertain and terrifying. On their 20th anniversary, Harrison took Victoria back to the rise where he'd first told her he loved her. The land looked different now. Their house was visible in the distance, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch. The cattle herd was substantial, dotting the prairie like moving shadows. Their children were at home with Mrs. Patterson, who was in her 70s now but still spry and always happy to help. "You remember?" Harrison asked, his arm around her waist. "I remember everything," Victoria said. "I remember being so scared I couldn't think straight. I remember you telling me you were my only answer. You know I didn't mean you didn't have other options. I know. You meant you were the right answer, and you were. You are." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but to her, he was as handsome as the day she met him. "The winter made me question everything, but you gave me something I could be sure of, a love I could trust, a life I could build. You gave me myself. You did that. I just believed in you until you could believe in yourself. That's everything, though, don't you see? You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I thought I was worthless. You loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. That's everything, Harrison." He kissed her, slow and sweet, and when they pulled apart they stood together looking out at the land they'd built together, the life they'd created from nothing but determination and love. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one." "You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner. We found each other at exactly the right time. I wasn't ready before. I had to lose everything to understand what really mattered. They stood there as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, and Victoria felt a deep sense of peace. The questions that had once consumed her had long since been answered. Not with words, but with the life she'd lived, the choices she'd made, the love she'd chosen. She was Victoria Monroe, rancher's wife, mother, teacher, and most importantly, herself. Fully, completely, unapologetically herself. And it had all started with a winter that made her question everything and a cowboy who became her answer. As they walked back to their horses, hand in hand, Victoria thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how disaster and despair could transform into joy and purpose, how the worst moment of her life had led directly to the best. She'd been so lost that winter day, frozen and frightened and ready to give up. And then Harrison had appeared like something out of a fever dream, and everything had changed. Not instantly, not easily, but gradually, steadily, one day at a time. He'd helped her build a life worth living. More than that, he'd given her the space and support to discover who she really was, underneath all the expectations and obligations that had buried her true self for so long. When they got home, their children rushed out to greet them, and Victoria's heart swelled with love. Henry was 15 now, tall and serious, already handling many of the ranch's day-to-day operations. Grace was 12, bright and curious, planning to go to the teaching college in Denver next year. And William, at 10, was all cowboy, already talking about the ranch he'd run someday. Mrs. Patterson came out behind them, smiling. "How was your ride?" "Perfect," Victoria said, hugging the older woman. "Thank you for watching them." "My pleasure. These three are never any trouble." Mrs. Patterson had never married, had poured all her love and energy into her students, and she'd become like family to the Monroes over the years. "I made stew for dinner. Figured you'd be hungry." That night, with the children in bed and the house quiet, Victoria and Harrison sat on the porch watching the stars. It was a warm June night, nothing like that frozen winter day 20 years ago, but Victoria remembered it like it was yesterday. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked. "About how different my life could have been. If the stagecoach hadn't broken down, if you hadn't come looking for those cattle, if I'd made it to Denver. You'd have been fine. You're strong, Victoria. You'd have found your way. Maybe, but I don't think I'd have been happy. I think I'd have spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be, never knowing what I wanted for myself. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to. I'm glad I met you when I did, even if the circumstances were terrible. Because you showed me what life could be like when you're honest with yourself and the people around you." Harrison pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "I'm the lucky one," he said. "I'd resigned myself to being alone. Told myself I didn't need anyone, that the work was enough. And then I found you, and suddenly everything meant more. The ranch wasn't just about building something for myself. It was about building something for us, for our family. You gave my life purpose beyond just surviving. We gave that to each other." "Yeah, we did." They sat in comfortable silence, and Victoria thought about all the years ahead, their children growing up and making their own choices, the ranch continuing to grow and prosper. Grandchildren someday, carrying on the legacy they'd built. Growing old together, still partners, still in love. It was a good life. No, it was a great life. The life she'd chosen, the life she'd built with her own hands and heart. The next morning, Victoria was in the garden when Henry came riding up fast, his face worried. "Ma, we've got trouble. Some of the cattle got through the fence on the north pasture. They're headed toward the miller's land." Victoria dropped her hoe and ran for the barn, calling for Harrison. Within minutes, they were all mounted and riding hard toward the north pasture. Grace and William left behind with instructions to stay close to the house. The next few hours were chaos as they rounded up the escaped cattle and repaired the fence. It was hot, dusty work, and by the time they had everything secured, Victoria was exhausted and filthy. But as she rode back to the house with Harrison and Henry, she found herself laughing. "Remember when I couldn't even stay on a horse?" "I remember," Harrison said, grinning. "You've come a long way, Mrs. Monroe. We've come a long way." That summer, they had more visitors than usual. Word had spread about the Double M Ranch, about the couple who'd built it from nothing, and several young families stopped by asking for advice. Harrison and Victoria welcomed them all, shared what they'd learned, helped where they could. One evening, a young woman arrived on a tired horse, asking if they had any work available. Her name was Sarah. She was running from an abusive situation back east, and she had nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate determination to start over. Victoria saw herself in Sarah's eyes, that same mixture of fear and hope, and she knew immediately what she had to do. "We can use help around the house and garden," she said. "Room and board plus a small wage. Interested?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, thank you. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," Victoria said gently. "I was in a similar situation once. Sometimes we all need someone to give us a chance." Sarah stayed with them for 6 months, helping around the house and learning ranch skills. Victoria taught her to ride, to shoot, to believe in herself again. And when Sarah was ready, Victoria helped her get a job at the hotel in Tascosa, where she eventually met and married a kind freight hauler and started her own family. It was the first of many times Victoria would help women starting over. She became known in the area as someone who would give people a chance, who understood what it meant to need a fresh start. The ranch became a sort of informal refuge, and Victoria and Harrison never turned anyone away who genuinely needed help. "You're building something bigger than a ranch, Mrs. Patterson observed one day, watching Victoria teach a young woman how to keep books. "You're building a community." "I'm paying it forward," Victoria said. "Harrison gave me a chance when I needed it most. How can I do less for others?" As the years continued to pass, Victoria found new ways to contribute to the community. She started a lending library in Tascosa, donating books and encouraging others to do the same. She organized a women's group that met monthly to discuss everything from politics to poetry. She advocated for better conditions for the workers on the larger ranches, using her own experience to argue for fair treatment. Harrison supported her in all of it, proud of her passion and intelligence. They were true partners, each making the other stronger. When Henry turned 18, he announced he wanted to go to agricultural college to learn new ranching techniques. Victoria and Harrison scraped together the money to send him, proud of his ambition. He came back 2 years later full of ideas for improving their operation, and father and son worked side by side implementing them. Grace went to teaching college as planned and came back to Tascosa to take over from Mrs. Patterson, who finally retired at 80. Grace brought new energy to the school, and Victoria helped her develop programs to reach the Mexican and Native American children who often didn't attend regularly. William, true to form, stayed on the ranch and became the best horseman in the county. He started breeding horses on the side, developing a line known for their endurance and intelligence. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Henry brought his wife and 2 children. Grace came with her fiancé, a lawyer from Amarillo. William was courting a rancher's daughter from the next county. Mrs. Patterson, now 90, sat in a place of honor, still sharp as a tack and telling stories about Victoria's early teaching days. As Victoria looked around the crowded table, listening to the laughter and conversation, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was her family, not just by blood, but by choice, by love, by years of showing up for each other. After dinner, Harrison led her outside, and they walked to the small cemetery on the hill where they'd buried beloved horses and dogs over the years. But they weren't there to mourn. They were there to remember. 30 years, Harrison said. Feels like a lifetime and no time at all. The best 30 years of my life, Victoria said. The only 30 years that felt like mine. Any regrets? It was a ritual now, this question he asked on their anniversaries, and her answer was always the same. Not a single one. I love you, Victoria Monroe. I loved you when you were half frozen in the snow. I loved you when you were questioning everything. I love you now, after 30 years and 3 children and more adventures than I can count, and I'll love you until my last breath. I love you too. You saved me, Harrison, not just from the cold. From a life that wasn't mine. You gave me permission to be myself, and that's the greatest gift anyone can give. They kissed as the sun set behind them, and Victoria thought about that terrified, frozen woman she'd been 3 decades ago. She thought about all the questions that had consumed her, all the doubt and fear, and she was grateful for all of it, because it had led her here to this moment, to this man, to this life. The winter had made her question everything. But Harrison had been the answer, her only answer. Not because she had no other choices, but because he was the right choice. The choice her heart had known even when her head was still catching up. As they walked back to the house, arms around each other, Victoria smiled. She was 53 years old, her hair was graying, her hands were rough from work, and she'd never been happier. This was who she was meant to be. This was the life she was meant to live. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, who'd offered her a chance when she thought she had none left, who'd loved her enough to let her find her own way. Thank you, she said suddenly. For what? For finding me. For saving me. For loving me. For building this life with me. Harrison smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip. Thank you for choosing me, for trusting me, for building this life with me. I'm the lucky one, Victoria, I always have been. They went inside together, back to their family, back to the celebration. And as Victoria looked around at the life they'd built, the love they'd nurtured, the legacy they were creating, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice, the only choice, the best choice. Years later, when Victoria was in her 70s and Harrison's hair had gone completely white, they still sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset over their land. The ranch had grown substantially. Henry ran the cattle operation now, with his own sons learning the trade. William's horse breeding program was known throughout Texas and beyond. Grace had eventually moved to Austin with her husband, but she visited often with their 4 children. The original cabin was still standing, preserved as a reminder of where they'd started. Victoria sometimes went there to sit and remember those early days, the uncertainty and the hard work and the overwhelming love that had carried them through. Mrs. Patterson had passed away 5 years ago, peacefully in her sleep at 95. They'd buried her in the cemetery on the hill, with a stone that read, "Beloved friend and teacher." Victoria still missed her terribly, but she was grateful for all the years they'd had. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Harrison said, "Tell me again about that day I found you." It was a story they'd told many times to their children and grandchildren, to people who asked how they'd met. But Victoria never tired of telling it. "It was the coldest day of my life," she began. "I thought I was going to die. I'd given up. And then I heard your horse, and you appeared like some kind of miracle, and you wrapped me in your coat and told me you had me. Those were the words I needed to hear. I had you. I wasn't alone anymore. I knew the moment I saw you, Harrison said. I knew you were going to change my life. You couldn't have known that, but I did. Maybe not consciously, but something in me recognized something in you, and I was right. You changed everything. We changed everything together. They sat in silence, holding hands, and Victoria thought about how strange and wonderful life was. How you could plan and prepare and think you knew what you wanted, and then life would come along and completely upend everything. How the worst moments could lead to the best. How love could appear when you least expected it and transform everything. She thought about the woman she'd been, scared and lost and convinced she had no value. And she looked at the woman she'd become, strong and confident and surrounded by love. The journey between those two people had been long and sometimes painful, but it had been worth every step. "I'm tired," Harrison said eventually, his voice a little weaker than it used to be. "Help me inside." Victoria helped him to his feet, noticing how he leaned on her more heavily than he once had. They were both getting old, their bodies not what they used to be. But their love was as strong as ever, maybe stronger, tempered by decades of partnership and mutual respect. That night, lying in bed with Harrison's arms around her, Victoria thought about mortality for the first time in a long while. They wouldn't live forever. Someday, probably not too far in the future, one of them would leave the other behind. The thought made her sad but not afraid. They'd had a good life. They'd loved well and been loved in return. Their children and grandchildren were thriving. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, a testament to what they'd built together. "Harrison," she whispered. Do you believe in heaven?" "I believe in this," he said, pulling her closer. "This right here, this is heaven. You and me together, our family, our home, our life. If there's something after, that's fine. But I've already had everything I could want right here. Me too. No regrets. Not a single one." She fell asleep in his arms, and she dreamed of snow and horses and a cowboy who told her she mattered when she thought she didn't. She dreamed of all the days between then and now, all the moments of joy and struggle that had woven together into a life. When she woke, Harrison was still beside her, and the sun was streaming through the window, and she was grateful for another day. They had 5 more good years together. 5 years of watching grandchildren grow, of sitting on the porch, of quiet conversations and comfortable silences. 5 years of continued partnership and deepening love. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep one night in early spring, with Victoria beside him. She woke to find him gone, and the grief nearly broke her. But even in her sorrow, she was grateful. Grateful for every moment they'd had, for the life they'd built, for the love they'd shared. At his funeral, which seemed like half of Texas attended, Victoria stood by his grave and spoke about the man he'd been. "Harrison Monroe saved my life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "But more than that, he taught me how to live. He taught me that love is a choice you make every day, that partnership means standing side by side through everything, that a life well lived is measured not in wealth or status, but in the love you give and receive. He was my husband, my partner, my best friend, and my only answer when I was questioning everything. I will love him until my last breath and beyond." Victoria lived another 3 years after Harrison's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She continued to be active in the community, mentoring young women, supporting the school, and telling stories about the old days. She was peaceful, content with the life she'd lived, missing Harrison every day but not consumed by grief. She spent her last year writing down her story, wanting her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to understand where they'd come from. She wrote about the winter that had changed everything, about the cowboy who'd saved her, about the ranch they'd built, and the love that had sustained them. On a warm June day, exactly 50 years after she'd married Harrison, Victoria passed away quietly in her sleep. Her children found her in the morning, her journal open beside her, the last entry simply reading, "I'm coming home, my love." They buried her next to Harrison on the hill overlooking the ranch, under a stone that read Victoria Monroe. Beloved wife, mother, teacher, and friend, she lived a life she chose. At her funeral, Henry read from her journal, sharing her story with all who'd gathered. And when he finished, Grace stood and said, "Our mother taught us that it's never too late to start over, that love is worth the risk, and that the life you build is more important than the life you're given." She questioned everything and found her answers in love, in work, in family. She was the strongest person I've ever known, and I'm proud to be her daughter. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story Victoria and Harrison had begun. The old cabin was preserved and eventually became a small museum, telling the story of the couple who'd built something from nothing. And on quiet evenings when the sun set over the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, people said you could sometimes see two figures standing on the hill, hand in hand, looking out over the land they'd loved. Whether it was true or just a story, it didn't matter. Because the love Victoria and Harrison had shared was real, and it lived on in the land, in their descendants, in the lives they'd touched and the legacy they'd left behind. Victoria had started as a woman who questioned everything, who didn't know who she was or what she wanted. She'd ended as a woman who knew herself completely, who'd built a life of purpose and love, who'd touched countless lives with her strength and kindness. And it had all begun with a winter day and a cowboy who'd said, "I'm your only answer," not because she had no other choices, but because he was the right choice. The choice her heart had known all along, the choice that had led to everything good in her life, the choice she'd never, not for a single moment, regretted.